He has been called the definitive chronicler of Canada's journalistic travails, having written 7 books on the subject. He's also that rarest of birds in our media ecosystem, that of critic. Here to talk about his latest book, The Postmedia Effect, how Vulture Capitalism is wrecking our news, is BC-based journalist, author, and academic Marc Edge. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you.
Uh, I'll talk about the book in a moment, but I just wanted to jump on something I mentioned in the introduction there. I really wanted your thoughts on why media criticism is so rare in this country. I can only think of a handful of people who do it, yourself included, of course. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a very good question. And Jesse Brown, who went on to found Canada Land, asked that very question about 5 or 10 years ago in the Walrus magazine. And he concluded that Canada's media is a very kind of closed club. It's a very highly concentrated in ownership, of course. So you have to watch what you say if you want to get another job. Well, I gave up worrying about that years ago.
And here we are, 7 books in. So let's talk about the Postmedia Effect then. It picks up where some of your earlier books, like Aspiration, leave off. You start off by describing what you call the hedge fundification of the newspaper business. How did we get here, and is there a way back?
Well, we got here because these hedge funds are very crafty investors, and during the last recession in 2008, 2009, they began buying up the distressed debt of newspaper companies across North America. In Canada, it was CanWest Global Communications was way overextended with debt through this millennium experience of convergence in which multimedia ownership was supposed to be the way of the future. So, of course, CanWest owned the Global Television Network and then bought the Southern newspaper chain from Conrad Black, who had recently taken it over and went up to their eyeballs in debt. Well, when the recession hit, their revenues plunged and they were unable to service this debt. The same with several of the largest chains in the U.S. that are all now in the hands of hedge funds. And the hedge fund strategy has been to squeeze them for everything they're worth, cut costs, strip assets. The main thing in the Postmedia story is that they bought so much of their debt, they used some of it to buy the company, and they kept the rest on the books to basically bleed it dry. So at the moment, they're paying about $30 million a year in interest payments to the hedge funds, who are also their owners. So instead of the returns, any returns going to the shareholders, they're going to the bondholders.
And what does that do to journalism then?
Well, all newspapers have had to cut back in the wake of their plummeting revenues. But at the Postmedia chain and other chains that are owned by hedge funds, they've had to cut twice as much. In fact, they've cut so much that there's not much left. And unfortunately for Postmedia, they went underwater again last year when their profits were only about $13 million, almost 10 million of which came from government subsidies. And they're, like I say, their annual interest payments are 30 million. So they've had to start selling off real estate. They sold off the Calgary Herald building to U-Haul to turn it into storage lockers. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen yet, but something's got to give pretty soon.
Now, as I asked earlier, is there a way back, do you see here?
Well, the only way back I see is for the whole thing to go bust again and pick up the pieces from there. It would be nice to salvage some of these historic publications that they've got their hooks into. The Vancouver Province started publishing in 1898, the Vancouver Sun in 1913. Well, the Montreal Gazette, I think, dates to the 17th century. So I think the government will have to make a decision either to bail out Postmedia again or maybe make a deal with the hedge funds, buy the titles from them, and see them on their merry way.
Now, we talk about government intervention. The idea of extending tax credits to the newspaper sector, like other cultural sectors enjoy, was briefly floated and then shot down. What happened there?
Well, the tax credit system was actually implemented about 5 years ago. In 2018, the newspaper industry they lobbied very hard for a full bailout, having been only given $50 million that year in what's called the Local Journalism Initiative to bolster underserved communities in the reporting of. Well, that wasn't enough for the for the newspapers. They howled and screamed and kicked their feet until they got a full bailout. They even ran blank front pages one day, except for the Globe and Mail. And finally, they got $595 million in tax credits over 5 years. That runs out this year, so they need something to replace that. Like I say, most of Postmedia's profits now come from the government. So if they don't have that, they're going broke pretty fast.
Now, if there's a central character in the Postmedia Effect, it's likely former CEO Paul Godfrey. First off, how much of this situation is his fault, and how much of this can be laid at the feet of the Competition Bureau and weak regulation, or regulatory neglect, as you call it?
Well, I think they're pretty well equally to blame if you're looking for someone to blame, but I don't know if I can really blame Godfrey for doing a very good job of what he was hired to do. He was just working the system. And the system, especially the antitrust system in the Competition Bureau, is extremely lax indeed. After forming Postmedia out of the remnants of the former Southern chain, a few years later, they bought the second largest chain in Canada, Sun Media, which never should have been allowed, but it exposed actually the fatal flaw in the Competition Act, a long dormant provision called the efficiencies defense, which if you can prove that you will achieve efficiencies of operation through your takeover, even if it's a monopoly, if those efficiencies outweigh the detriment to the public, then your merger or takeover has to be approved. Well, the Competition Bureau, they didn't even try to put a number on the public detriment, whereas Postmedia, I think they came up with efficiencies that amounted to about one half of one full-time back office position. So the Supreme Court of Canada, under their recent decision in Tervita, that would be enough. So the Competition Bureau just kind of waved it through, and even the regulators now are saying that something's got to be done to get rid of this efficiencies defense to strengthen the Competition Act and give it any teeth at all.
Now, when we talk about the bailout that ended up happening for the print sector, it was more of a bailout of legacy print media and not the innovators the government claimed to want to protect. And you bring up the example of a paper in the Maritimes that was kind of doing all the right things, you would think, but was not eligible for this bailout.
Yes, well, the legacy media and newspapers speak with a much louder voice than the smaller, more fragmented online operations through their industry association, News Media Canada. In fact, the online journalism groups quit in frustration a few years ago because they felt their voices weren't being heard, and they formed their own association. But the way it looks like it's going to shake out is that most of the money will go to the old media rather than the new media, which would really serve to stifle innovation. Some people argue that they should let the old media go down and allow the new media to evolve and take their place.
Don't see that happening, though, do we? Now, much has happened in the brief time since the book went to print, mainly the passage of Bill C-18, that's the federal law, which would require the likes of Google and Meta, that is to say Facebook and Instagram, to pay for news content shared on its platforms. Meta has already said that Canadians will no longer have access to news content on its platforms as a result of this. What effect do you think this will have on journalism?
Well, I think the whole thing's going to backfire on them. I think, well, Meta definitely, they're not going to blink this time. They're not going to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to carry links to Canadian news stories. They've been operating a free service up until now. In fact, the newspapers, a lot of them pay Facebook to boost their posts. They will post a link online. Now, do they expect that Facebook will pay them for the privilege? I don't think so. The big question is Google. Is there enough utility in carrying links to Canadian news stories for them to pay hundreds of millions of dollars a year, or can they make a deal with the federal government to limit that liability? I think those are the kind of talks that are going on right now, and we'll hear about them in the fullness of time.
Is that going to be the subject of the next book? I mean, what is the next chapter of this, of the Postmedia Effect, or of legacy print media in this landscape?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we're in for a very interesting couple of years, and I'll be there to write the book on it. I'm working on a book right now on how to fix Canada's media, so I'll be watching the developments very closely.
And what do you hope people get out of this book then?
Well, hopefully we'll get a new model. Instead of all this patchwork quilt of bailouts and subsidies, some are calling for a new paradigm, a totally revised system of news delivery in Canada. And I see it evolving more along the lines of nonprofit organizations. What's really ruined journalism in Canada has been the profit motive, because for so many years it was very, very profitable indeed. Now it's not so profitable, but they're still trying to squeeze every last drop out. So maybe after they've bitten the dust, we can come up with something a little bit better.
The name of the book is The Postmedia Effect: How Vulture Capitalism is Wrecking Our News. It's available from New Star Books. My thanks to author Marc Edge.
My pleasure.